Hi, I'm Jan Ozer. I'm chatting today with Dominic Sunnebo, Commercial Director at Worldpanel by Numerator. We're going to discuss the Entertainment on Demand Q2 25 report and the data it highlights around sports, ad-supported tiers, and localized streaming growth. Thanks for joining me, Dominic.
Thanks for the invite, John.
So tell us about the report, Dominic.
So I think this is a report about Q2 2025, looking across the streaming sector in multiple different markets. And I think it's been a really interesting quarter. It was a very positive quarter in some ways. So we saw that sports played a really key part in acquisition across a number of different markets. So now almost 1 in 4 new consumers in the streaming sector is being driven by sports content. So that's something we're seeing really start to accelerate at the moment. On the flip side, it was the lowest number of new subscribers since around 2023. So what we are starting to see, particularly in mature markets, the US, the UK, a lot of the Western European markets, is we really are getting to what we might call peak penetration. So, those who want to have a streaming service already have one. And so that sort of acquisition-led growth is becoming harder and harder to come by at the moment.
Okay, how do you gather data for a report like this?
So we have big longitudinal consumer panels across all the markets we operate in. Say, for example, in the US, we're speaking with 20,000 households every month. We're getting lots of different details about what services they subscribe to, their experience of those services, if they're signing up to a new service, what was the content, was it a film or a series or a specific sporting event? So we're able to really deep dive into what's happening in those households and understand that longitudinal movement. So how people are sort of switching from one service to another, turning services on, turning services off, to give a real sort of granular insight into the behavior.
So you talked about the 24% subscriber growth relating to sports, but you also talked about saturation. So is sports driving net new subs, or is it just switching from one service to another?
It is increasingly driving new net subs because, as I say, most people who want streaming have streaming. Most people who have streaming already have Netflix. So I think the room for growth in that sort of traditional sector is starting to reach a little bit of a ceiling. Of course, with the sports sector, you've still got a huge number of people subscribing to the traditional cable TV or sort of satellite networks. That is still definitely a little bit of a higher ceiling for growth. But we are starting to see, as rights are getting bought up by some of the major streaming companies, people are starting to move across. And I think, the interesting thing about sports compared to releasing a new film or a new series is people's loyalty is to their sports team, it's to the sports they love. It's not to the service that provides it. If they want to watch football and that service has moved from one service to another, those people, on the most part, are going to move with them. And I think, that's in some ways why it's so expensive buying sports rights. You have a guaranteed audience as part of that investment.
Yeah, but I guess it's a rented audience. Once you stop showing that team, you're gonna, and whoever sends it broadcasts it next is gonna grab those customers.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think a rented audience is a very good way to put it. People's loyalty is not particularly to the platform.
One of the things we're seeing here in the United States, and I have two children who are big into women's sports, is just the rise of women's sports from a sponsorship and a live event programming. What are you seeing? What did you see with the report, and what's your reflection on that?
So I think women's sports is very much having its moment at the moment. So there's a lot of momentum behind it, and I think generally in sports it's a cliche: success breeds success. So, for example, if you think about the women's Euros, which were recently on over in the UK, they were filling 30, 40,000 seater stadiums. We'd never seen that happening before. And I think most people would agree the quality, certainly within women's football, is increasing incredibly rapidly. And so as that quality increases, as they're filling more stadiums, as the nations are feeling success, more and more people, are taking to watching those sports. And I think what we're really seeing at the moment is it's complementary. So if we have a look at the data, the entertainment on demand data, not that many people are watching just women's sports. They tend to be very heavily engaged across the board. They're watching men's football, and women's football is additive. They're sort of having a new way to watch more sports. And I think that's a very, very good thing.
I'm shocked that anybody watches WWE, but obviously that's me. But I mean, Netflix picking that up, is that that's almost a discordant note for me. And Netflix is such a highly restricted brand, and WWE is just kind of out there. I mean, what's your sense of is that good for the brand, bad for the brand?
I think because Netflix itself is such a powerful brand, it's one of the few companies which has, the ability to absorb what is again another really powerful brand. I think wrestling is incredibly well known around the world. We are seeing in the data some people saying they are joining Netflix just for the wrestling. We see that, of course, with football, and wrestling is a rather more niche sport. But actually, I think this is more about engagement. It's not driving huge amounts of standalone acquisition for Netflix. Some people are joining, but it's not the majority. What we are seeing is it's driving engagement across their base. And I think it's probably a good thing for the sport as well to bring a new sort of generation to be able to see that.
And second time you've mentioned engagement. I mean, that you're really just describing people watching. It's available on Netflix and they're watching it. Is that what you mean by engagement, or does it go beyond that?
I think it goes beyond that. Of course, you can watch wrestling live. The vast majority is not watched live. They bought the entire back catalogue across the Netflix. So again, a lot of these services, the big drivers of acquisition are new content. And of course, Netflix is pretty good with its pipeline and bringing new content onto the platform every week. But eventually, you watch those new shows and you're looking for something a little bit lighter, something familiar to pass the time. And that's where, old series like The Office are fantastic, but also wrestling can play a huge role there as well. So again, people can dip into the wrestling, when they're not sort of watching those tentpole titles. And that's really good for keeping that engagement going between releases.
Sports, I guess to a degree, not football or baseball or basketball were the big sports, but some sports seem to be focused on pay-per-view. Some of the, maybe WWE or certainly UFC and boxing. What's happening with pay-per-view? Is that kind of going away, or is that still a pretty dominant force when it relates to sports that are like the ones that I just mentioned?
I think it's going to be hard to move away from that pay-per-view model. I think particularly when you think around sports like boxing, the big games are not on every night of the week. There's sort of a huge amount of money involved. They're spaced out to build up, a lot of anticipation for those events. And they work well. They're incredibly profitable. People are prepared to pay that sort of one-off price. And I think, if people are going to join a streaming service and their predominant sport is boxing, and they want to watch the big games, there's not enough between those big games to keep them engaged. So I think for the foreseeable future, it's a method which is proven and it continues to work well.
Who are the big pay-per-view brands as you're seeing it?
And people like DAZN, certainly play a huge role in that. Apple TV to some extent as well. I think DAZN, is investing very heavily, pretty much across the world. They're seeing pretty strong growth in most of the markets that we're looking at the moment. But DAZN, if you compare them to the likes of Netflix or Warner Brothers Discovery, it's a much smaller company. And I think the amount these companies are having to pay for sports rights is becoming a challenge. We spoke earlier about the fact you buy rights to a certain sport and you're to some extent guaranteed an audience. But actually, you've still got to make profit at the end of it, even if that audience is prepared to come across. And I think that's where companies like DAZN are going to start to get a little bit squeezed, where you've got people like Amazon increasingly coming in, buying the big events like the US Open in golf. Can they compete long term? I think that's a question we're going to have to wait to see.
Is there any analog for smaller brands like BritBox or Shutter or any of those guys? I mean, do sports have a play there, or they just have to find a different way to grow new subscribers?
I think it's going to be a big challenge for those smaller brands. I think a lot of their success or relative success comes from the fact they are specialised. They found a niche, and they know there's a big enough audience to fulfil that niche. I think if they start to try and go a little bit wider, away from their core audience, they're not going to be able to compete with the big guys. I don't think that's a realistic route for them to go, particularly given the levels of investment involved and the fact that sports rights are bought over such a long period of time. These things have to be planned years and years in advance. It can't be a sort of impulse type decision for these smaller companies.
Can you give me an example of how sports really did well to grow subscribers and some examples where perhaps it didn't?
Yeah, so I think Amazon Prime Video, certainly thinking, probably across to Europe here, they bought rights to the Premiership football. And Prime Video is a huge company. Of course, it's been doing well for a while. They were growing fairly steadily. As soon as they bought the rights to the football in the UK, they saw a massive wave of growth. And I think one of the challenges, Amazon had is you've got a load of people signing up to Prime Video just to watch the football. And they weren't doing anything else. They just saw it as a destination to go to watch football. What Amazon, has managed to do over time is actually convince those people there's more to offer, of course, on that platform, and they've got them engaged in a lot of their other films and sort of TV series, and they've become heavily engaged customers, and that's what they want them to do. They're then able to move them on to the transactional side, so they're buying sort of new release films on the platform, and they're increasing, the average amount of revenue they're getting per user. So for someone like Amazon, the sports itself helps. It gets people across the platform, but of course, someone like Amazon can then start to monetize those customers in a whole host of different ways through advertising, through transactional, even through retail, of course, bringing them into that sort of whole Amazon brand.
Yeah, their ARPU is just crazy high. When you factor in Prime and all the buying stuff. Let's switch to the ad-supported tier market. You note that ad tier adoption is up 14%. Is that growth-driven demand, or is that mostly migration like, Prime's auto-enroll?
It is mostly genuine growth at the moment. So, of course, Prime took a different approach to everyone else, where they effectively forced their existing subscribers to move on to the ad tier unless they opted out. And actually, that was a really risky thing to do. No one else had really done it at that stage. And what we immediately saw was their net promoter score, their sort of levels of advocacy of their customers dropped pretty much overnight as a result of that. Because I think ultimately people don't like feeling like they're being forced to do something they haven't signed up for. 2 months later, we have short memories as humans. They've forgotten. They're fine again. So you saw this kind of, very, very sharp dip. People thought, actually, it's not as bad as I thought it was. And the ad load was pretty low, when they launched that service. And actually what we're seeing now is their advocacy levels, their satisfaction is pretty much back to where it was previously. So I think, that actually for them has been a risk worth taking. If we think about growth in the sector generally, that happened in a big flash. It kind of happened overnight when they did that. The growth since then is genuinely organic. So I think what we see is we're not seeing huge swathes of customers move from ad-free to ad-supported. What we are seeing is when consumers are given a choice and they want to sign up to a new service, and one option is cheaper than the other, and it might only be $2, $3, humans tend to gravitate towards that cheaper option. As the first point in time, they'll say, that option's cheaper, I'll try it. If I don't like it, I have the option to trade up. But again, we are able to get used to things pretty quickly. So again, you might not think, I'm probably going to change up to the more expensive option. You start to realize pretty quickly, it's fine. You start to not really notice the ads. That's what you've experienced from the start. And so that's one driver. People are offered a cheaper price and they take that cheaper price. I think the other thing, and we're seeing this particularly, for example, with Disney, is they're going really big on partnerships at the moment. So if we look at, say, Disney, for example, in the UK or Germany, they're partnering with Uber, they're partnering with one of the biggest banks in the UK, Lloyds Bank, they're partnering with one of the biggest supermarkets. Those partnerships are only giving consumers the ability to take up the offer as part of the ad-supported service. So there's no choice there. So these partnerships themselves are really starting to help ad-supported grow because the consumer isn't given a choice in those matters.
The report mentions that Discovery Plus comes out on top for ad experience. What did they do right compared to the other services?
I think what we're seeing with Discovery Plus, and this is particularly the US market, which is actually driving this at the moment, is it's around the relevance of their ads. So I think we track a number of different metrics looking at sort of ad experience of how many ads were there, what were the length of the ads, were the ads repetitive? And again, we see pretty stark differences between the services across these sort of different areas. The one thing Discovery Plus is really getting right is relevance of ads. So the kind of ads people are seeing are relevant to their interest, they're relevant to the products or services they buy, and so they're able to make a real connection with those customers. And of course, as an advertiser, that is what you want. You want people to be interested in the ads you're showing them. You want them to then research a little further, obviously go on to buy your products and services. So knowing their customer seems to be the thing they're really getting right at the moment.
Is that contextual based or is that data driven?
Sorry, in terms of how well Discovery know their own customers?
Yeah, how are they getting such relevance?
I don't have a straight answer to that, so I'm not sure how they're able to do that. But what we do see is they've got a significant upper hand in terms of that customer profile. I think if you think about Discovery generally, they're very sort of quite a specific type of customer. So reality shows are really popular on Discovery. So again, I think they've been able to match the type of programs they're making with the type of products and services people are looking for.
So you talked about Discovery Plus and the general performance vis-a-vis ads. Is that ad load, or what are you seeing how ad loads relates to both consumer satisfaction and churn?
It plays a big role. We know for sure that when consumers are unhappy with ad load, we know that their advocacy rates fall through the floor and their churn rate immediately goes up. So a lot of the different companies which have got ad tiers across the US and a number of other markets have been gradually putting up the ad load. So Netflix, Prime Video, Disney all went in very low when they launched those services. Consumers hardly noticed there was any ads on the services at all. They have been gradually ramping those up. And what we see is they're taking that pretty slow. So consumers aren't able to really tangibly notice any sort of great change in the amount of ads they're seeing. But what we are seeing now is we are reaching a point where those sort of satisfaction levels are starting to tip back down again. So it feels like we're reaching a point at which they can't make easy further gains in order to further create revenue streams from that ad side of the business without it really impacting consumer satisfaction. And of course, a churn customer is very expensive to win back.
The ultimate. Can you translate those to minutes per hour, or is that not something you're prepared to do?
That's not something we track within the service, no.
So regarding the ad-supported services, are they reducing churn? They're going to reduce ARPU, the average revenue per user, presumably. But I guess I should check that. Are they reducing ARPU, or what's your sense of that?
It's very hard to know the answer to that, to be honest. Of course, they're paying less per month, but obviously as they're increasing the ad load, the amount of revenue they're getting in from users is increasing at the same time. And I think it's probably fair to say that given the focus of almost all the major streamers at the moment is on growing the ad tier, we can be pretty sure there's no significant loss in ARPU across those services at the moment.
It's not an anti-churn strategy, it's a growth strategy?
I think it's more a growth and a revenue driving strategy than churn. Churn levels between sort of ad-supported premium customers are pretty similar. We don't see any sort of great differences there. I think it's to some degree nice to have a little bit of a safety net. If people feel the service has become too expensive, they can start to receive ads and pay a lower monthly cost. We're not seeing a huge amount of that, to be honest, at the moment. So I think it's more about growing revenue and trying to win new customers to the services.
So the report highlights the rise of local services like WoW and some others. Where do they fit into the Netflixes? You only have so much time to watch TV. Where are they resonating with viewers?
This is really about local content, local languages, local language productions. That's really kind of where they found their niche. I think they're going to be under pressure, I would say. I think they're performing pretty well at the moment. But if you went back only 4 or 5 years and you looked at the top 10 most streamed titles, in Germany, in the US and the UK, they would look pretty much the same. If you go ahead and look at those top 10 now, you don't see a great deal of similarity. And that is really all about local content production. When you make local shows in Germany or the UK, they tend to do very well. People are very happy to watch Hollywood shows, but actually local shows tend to do better, relatively speaking. So I think that's where those local local companies like Wow and Join are able to fulfill the needs of that audience. But we do know, certainly Apple TV has recently started making original content in Germany, which has performed incredibly well. Apple's been doing a lot of great shows in the UK, like Ted Lasso, for a number of years now. And again, they've been hits not just in the UK, but also worldwide. So I think if the big guys, take it very seriously in terms of growing their local production quotas, that's something that is going to be a challenge for those local guys to compete with.
One of the things that happened, I guess, around the time of your report was the Netflix UI refresh. What are your observations about that?
It's interesting. I think when a completely new service launches in the market and you go and have a look at what consumers think of the interface, it's always low. They don't like it because they've never seen it before, because they've never used it before. Netflix historically has had the highest UI satisfaction ratings, bar none. It's consistently been at the top, and it's one of their really key strengths. And actually, it's been a reason why they've always done so well in winning people who are completely new to the sector, who've never had a streaming service before. It's a very easy, intuitive UI. All their friends have it, they know how to use it. And then suddenly Netflix made a relatively big change within the sector, and people thought, I don't recognise this, I don't like this. Actually, that was for about 1 month, we saw the sort of general feedback being relatively negative. People found it harder to find shows. They thought it was slower. It wasn't slower. Fast forward a couple of months, and again, that's pretty much risen back to where it was before. So I think this is really more of a question about familiarity. People being used to using the interface, knowing what to do, rather than actually saying and rejecting the changes that Netflix have made.
How would you describe the changes?
I think it's just more about Netflix having control over what you watch. So I think trying to pinpoint the shows they want you to see, the sort of suggestions they have now take up around 50% of the screen on most interfaces. So it's pretty hard, to scroll through and not notice what Netflix are trying to navigate you towards. I think that for me, that's probably the biggest single change. Okay.
And Netflix has already, their discoverability and their recommendation engines have always been incredibly effective from every data point that I've seen.
Yes.
Getting on that, I mean, how much does Netflix get to skate by based on brand versus content? If you were to look at their success, how much of it is real just good content and good usability versus, the fact that they're Netflix?
It's a hard question to unpick, I would say. I mean, I think the Netflix brand is incredibly strong. It's incredibly strong across almost all age groups. And I think, what Netflix has an amazing ability to do is take unloved shows and make them into the biggest hits there are. I think that's not just about their brand, it's about the ability of their marketing team, their social team, to create hype in a way that really no one else can. But I think, Netflix is not just well known and loved, it is incredibly well trusted. So people are always thinking about Netflix because they know they're going to be able to offer them something to watch. So I think one really interesting stat that we often talk to our clients about is what service do people go to first when they don't know what they're going to watch? And across almost every country, it's above 60% go to Netflix first. So they just dominate, that sort of discovery phase for people. And that's because Netflix is top of mind all the time. And that really is about the strength of the brand that they're able to bring.
Looking ahead to Q3 and Q4, what's the single most underreported risk you see relating to sports rights?
It's a difficult question. I think there's so much going on at the moment in terms of talk about sort of mergers. So we've got, talk about Warner Brothers Discovery being bought out by Paramount. We've got talk about Netflix potentially launching a bid for Warner Brothers Discovery. We don't know where sports rights are going to end up at the moment. I think women's sports, I think some people are still playing it a little bit safe and not making huge investments in that. And I think that's probably a little bit of a risk for people to not commit to that becoming the next major big thing in terms of sport. And again, those rights are going to get bought up for the next 3-4 years. So I think, people waiting a little bit too long before deciding to buy into, sports which are showing huge growth at the moment is probably a significant risk to some of their traditional players.
When can we look forward to your next report coming out?
So next report will be out mid-October.
Listen, thanks for taking the time to discuss this. Good to see you again, and hope to talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Jan. Good to talk.